I have 3 tips that I think can be helpful to guide families. First is name it, second is reframe it, and third is claim it. What I mean by that is first name it. It's helpful to name illness, emotions, just having honest conversations with kids. It can build trust with your kids and it can establish a framework for them on how to process situations that are new. By naming it, you're normalizing their reactions to keep their emotions from being bottled up, trying not to suppress the grief, but invite the grief to be shared in healthy outlets.
Welcome to the Inheritance of Hope podcast. Every day, 562 children lose a parent to terminal illness. They shouldn't have to face that alone. You can pretend to avoid the painful realities of illness, grief, and death, or you can deal with the real stuff in caring community. On the podcast, people in Inheritance of Hope's community share raw, personal stories of pain, trials, and the shadow of death, which are also stories of joy in terminal illness. Find more Inheritance of Hope community at inheritanceofhope.org. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Inheritance of Hope podcast. I'm Ellie, and today we will be unpacking some questions that a lot of families have when they're facing a terminal diagnosis and anticipatory grief. And we have an expert here today who can walk us through how to navigate that well and maybe answer some questions. So go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit of your background.
Yes, Ellie, it is so sweet to connect with you again. So I am a child life specialist, and I started in a hospital setting where I worked in pediatric oncology primarily. But then the beautiful thing about our hospital is that we could cover many different units. And so I also started working with children of adult patients during that time and just having a lot of exposure to grief in a lot of different settings in the hospital. And then I had the birth of my second son and decided to take a step back from the hospital and finish my master's in counseling. After that, I was so blessed to find Inheritance of Hope. And I actually started working with y'all as a Hope at Home groups coordinator, managing the support groups that was offered online. That was such a precious season to really work with families. So if you're listening and you are a family that has been served by Inheritance of Hope, I especially have such a special place and always will for the staff and volunteers and families at IOH. And now, currently, I am working as a child life specialist of my own private practice and business called Child Life to Go. And our mission is that we deliver the words to cope with illness, loss, and medical events, because I started to see the very huge value in providing a script for families to use when they're faced with something that feels impossible. On how do I tell my kids about this new diagnosis, about this new situation that we're facing. And that's kind of what started the passion for Child Life to Go, is creating those resources that can be taken to go into families' homes and helping them cope and also even thrive through their illness.
We're so excited to have you as a guest on the podcast because obviously you have such a depth of experience in multiple environment. So the hospital, working in a nonprofit, and now your own private practice, you have witnessed a lot of different stories and how this unfolds. And so today, as we unpack anticipatory grief, we know that you can speak from a lot of different experiences and stories of how you've seen people cope with something like a parent receiving a terminal diagnosis and having young kids in the family. So what does anticipatory grief mean if we're not familiar with that term, and how does that present?
I think anticipatory grief is actually a term some people may not even know about. In my family, we walked through anticipatory grief. And just even the other day, I was talking to my dad about this podcast and about anticipatory grief. And I was sharing my own experiences. My dad turned to me and said, "Wait, that was anticipatory grief? I've never even heard that term. I didn't even know that that's what we were walking through when we were facing a terminal illness of a loved one." And so I know that it can feel uncertain. And so I'd love to just break that down. because I also think that there can be some misconceptions on what we're talking about and what we're not talking about with anticipatory grief. So, in short, anticipatory grief is mourning a life change before anything happens or doesn't happen. So, that can include when a new illness is happening, like a terminal or progressive disease, a physical change, even like a mastectomy or hair loss or an amputation. It also can include when there's just a life change, like perhaps a divorce or becoming an empty nester, or even like your child starting kindergarten. All those things that are forcing a family to go through a transition and experience a change can involve a grief. And oftentimes people don't even realize that it's happening, and trying to provide some names to what is happening and what the family is experiencing can be so helpful. Anticipatory grief includes the whole family. So it not only involves the caregiver, so in the case of inheritance of hope families, the spouse or the partner or significant other and the children, but it also involves the person that is being cared for. And oftentimes that grief is simultaneous in the family. And another way to see anticipatory grief is that it's a process to resolve issues related to that life changing event as well.
Like you said, there's so much power in labeling something, and I know probably everyone listening to this has had that moment where you face something and then you just hear a term that just wraps it up, and there's some sense of closure that you get when you find a term or a concept that fits what you went through, especially if it's a difficult thing that you've gone through. And so I hope that people listening hear this and maybe something settles in their chest of like, okay, this is what it is. Then it helps them cope with what is at hand. Thank you for sharing that definition because I hope that brings that sense of closure to people listening.
It's interesting because through our own example is when I actually started to reframe how I saw anticipatory grief. Because I think the fear that is associated with anticipatory grief is it means accepting an end to something or expecting something horrible to happen. And again, that definition, it's mourning the change of something that could happen or not. So,
Mm.
anticipatory grief, by admitting that you're going through that, is not saying I'm accepting that the outcome could be very hard. And especially in the case of terminal illness, we're not talking about that it will result in loss. I ended up writing a children's guide on this for anticipatory grief. Is is it okay if I read a little excerpt from it?
Yes, please.
So, this is kind of the framework for how families and especially children, I think, can think about it. So let's pretend your life is like a house. You have a front porch, a front door, and inside the house is you. You're filled with imagination, creativity, and a big heart full of love for others. But one day, a package arrives on your front porch and it has a note. The note shared some news that you weren't expecting. It might have felt hard, confusing, or left you unsure about what it means and what will happen next. And then inside the package was something you didn't expect. Out popped a funny creature who just stood outside your house. It didn't come in, but you don't really know why it's there. Some days you hardly notice it. Other times it gives a little knock on the door or a tap on the window, just enough to remind you that it's there. The creature's name is anticipatory grief. It often shows up when a family hears hard news and doesn't know what will happen next. This creature isn't mean or scary. It isn't something anyone invited, and you didn't ask to be reminded of it, but it still comes. Sometimes the fuzzy, bumbly, anticipatory grief creature just waits patiently on your porch. You might not even notice it. It can be quiet and polite. But other times it shows up when you least expect it. You might be playing a game with your friend and suddenly you feel a little sad or distracted. You might be trying to fall asleep and there it is, knocking on the window of your mind and you feel worried. How annoying. So, this is just a
Mm.
small way that I think when we recognize some of the changes in ourselves, maybe it's a behavioral change or irritability or anxiousness or stress, that sometimes we're like, maybe it's that grief creature that's starting to tap on my window just a little bit. And I can ignore it. I can talk about it. I can go out and say some words to it and then close the door. But it's not time to come in. It's just there. And I think that that can sometimes be a helpful framework, especially with children, to help them name and understand and familiarize themselves with this little grief creature that can help them understand how to associate with it too.
It doesn't always need to be this big, mean, terrible thing that you're always feeling, this dread, but that constant presence, especially when you're not expecting it, can be really hard for anybody, but especially kids, because they might not have the category to put it in or know how to handle that. So that's such a good analogy. It just kind of taps on the window sometimes, and it's unsettling.
Yeah, it's not something that we have to fear, but it's something that can teach us even more about ourselves. And in fact, sometimes even be used to grow our resiliency.
And one good analogy to add to yours, maybe for an adult listening, is from a previous podcast guest, Jacqueline Vranikers. She says everyone gives the example of, oh, anybody can be hit by a bus. Anybody can die at any time. And while that's true, having a terminal diagnosis is like you're in the middle of the road and you cannot move and you see the bus coming towards you and you can't get out of the way. And I feel like that captures anticipatory grief really well because it's like, okay, I'm still here. The bus isn't here yet, but I see it coming.
Mhm.
And you can look around, you can see other things, but anytime you turn your head, you see that the bus is coming. And that has a lot of fear attached to it, but maybe you don't have to look the bus dead in the eyes every single time you turn your head that way.
Yeah, because there can be such an unknown with that bus. Is it here to take me somewhere else? Is it here to smash me? Is it here
Mhm.
to just be something that passes by in my life? Like that unknown and unfamiliarity is what to you said, yes, can be so scary. And trying to learn, how do I actually just exist in the day, knowing that this change is happening, but how do I try to do what I can in my control to not just survive, but also still keep flourishing, even especially for kids, how parents and caregivers, of course, want to see that with their children, to play and to be kids, even when things are unfamiliar or unsettling or uncertain.
What are some concrete examples of how a family can operate within the tension of feeling that anticipatory grief?
One of the ways I also like to define anticipatory grief is that it's grieving what was, what is, and what could be. I love to just break that down with those three things. So, um, when anticipatory grief happens, we grieve what was. We grieve routines that we used to have, or abilities or activities. And um, I'll even explain these three things with a story of a family where I met a mom that her husband had just been diagnosed with ALS. And she and I talked literally the very next day after he was diagnosed. And she was verbally processing. And I heard her articulate the grief of what was, where she said, yes, I'm glad I can talk to you right now. My husband's actually at the grocery store right now getting some stuff for dinner. And then she paused and she said, he probably isn't going to be able to do that much longer, and trailed
Mm.
off. And I think in that moment, you capture that grief of what was, that in real time, she's processing the ways that their family is inevitably going to change. Then fast forward, I talked to her a year later after he is having his disease progress. And now I'm talking to her from a sense of her processing and grieving what is. So his abilities have started to change. They're settling into a new normal that also continues to transition and change along with his needs. And she's just processing like, man, I'm now reflecting to you all the things that we have walked through, but also what we are currently walking through. And in this conversation, she talked about, my son can't play baseball with his dad anymore. And they used to love to play baseball. And he's even anticipating a feeding tube this week. And we're trying to prepare our kids for the changes that they're going to start to see. So she's grieving what is. And then in that same conversation, she's also grieving with me what could be. How much longer do we have with him? How much harder is this going to get? How are our kids going to handle this? And in the case of ALS, it can feel like this impending loss. There's so much uncertainty that is wrapped in that. And I feel like that is something that is helpful for parents to even think through, to even name or be attentive to, of the grieving what was, what is, and what could come. And I'm happy to go into tips on how to navigate that too. But I think that's one of the first places to start when we think about anticipatory grief and how it can impact our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions.
That's such a good breakdown because I'm sure people listening to that resonate with that story. And and it's complex and it's changing for each season. And so anticipatory grief is this umbrella. But within that, there's so many different facets and it's going to show up different ways. And there's going to be different triggers, different things that pop up at different times that feel sharper than in other seasons. So walking us through those three stages is a helpful framework.
One of the things that I think is so helpful is the dual process model, the DPM, which is actually more applied to after a loss. And again, we're not assuming through anticipatory grief that loss is inevitable in every situation, but I think that it does provide a healthy framework on how the dual process model talks about a way to oscillate between two types of stressors: the stressor of loss oriented, so the processing grief, and that's when you are joining support groups and thinking about the grief and missing things before life changed. But then there's this other part that is the restoration oriented part, and that's the adaptation to life. So establishing new routines like doctor's visits or medications, creating new traditions, um, or just even ways of connecting to each other, and also family roles. And with the DPM, you actually go between all those things. You're going to a support group, but then you're also getting your kids off to school and you're managing medications for your loved one, but then you're also going and doing a play date. And you're coexisting in these two worlds, which can feel at odds with each other, but there's actually something beautiful to be said about the way that they can coexist, just like grief and hope can also coexist at the same time.
Mm.
And those are all ways of just continuing to move through the anticipatory grief process together as a family and recognizing, oh, I'm shifting gears in these two different stressors in these two different worlds, but we're doing it together and we're moving forward together as well.
And sometimes you kind of just have to pretend like your life is normal, while on this other hand, things are not normal by any means, but you have to coexist in both worlds. So giving that language to it is hopefully going to be really helpful for people. So with this knowledge and these terms, what would you say to a family who's maybe listening to this and saying, that is exactly where we're at right now? How can we move forward and lean into that resilience building that you talked about and almost use this anticipatory grief well and use it to your advantage in a way?
One of the things is that there's actually research that shows that suppressed grief tends to increase distress later. And so I think what that can actually empower families to know is that by trying to actually invite the voice or the space or the feelings to be expressed of grief, that you're adding deposits of resiliency for your family and for your kids for the future with whatever might happen. I'm not saying that the worst case scenario could come true, but you are helping your kids recognize that we are facing this together. We're naming, we're expressing things with the understanding of we're going to be expectant to how our courage is going to grow as a family. Brene Brown has a quote that says, if you know how it's going to end, that isn't courage. And so I think when grief comes and it feels like it's happening to us, like we don't want that bus to come. We don't want this creature to be on our porch. Very understandable. Like this is hard. It's okay to name that. And we can also see the unknown as something that's going to continue to increase our courage and our resiliency. And when I think about families that are even thinking, how do I start to have this conversation with my kid? And how do I start to move through this together when I myself can feel like I barely know how to move through it? I have 3 tips that I think can be helpful to guide families. First is name it. Second is reframe it. And third is claim it. What I mean by that is first name it. It's helpful to name illness, emotions, just having honest conversations with kids. It can build trust with your kids and it can establish a framework for them on how to process situations that are new. By naming it, you're normalizing their reactions to keep their emotions from being bottled up, trying not to suppress the grief, but invite the grief to be shared in healthy outlets. So, modeling for your kids. It's okay if you have I call it a grief burst or a grief wave, when you yourself are having that as a parent or caregiver, to model that for their kids to help them, again, develop some schema or some understanding of what grief is so that they can better understand that themselves too. And Research also shows that helping individuals notice their own anticipatory grief can actually help them face it properly. So, again, name it. And then the second is reframe it. And there was another strategy called narrative therapy. And essentially, that's trying to share your experiences to find different perspectives on a situation rather than only the painful ones. Sometimes when you're in the thick of a terminal illness or illness just in general, or even caring for someone else, that it can be really hard to see other perspectives. And so being able to share your experiences, having other people reflect the things that they're noticing in your family and the courage that they're having, or the love that they see, or the resilience that is blossoming, that can help add a widen or expanded view. And constructing a narrative of anticipatory grief that supports really resilience rather than despair is something that I think that families can be encouraged in. And then the final thing of claiming it. So, for families that are facing unknown things, staying in the day is critical and yet sometimes feels really impossible.
Mm.
So, doing things that can bring joy for a family, I oftentimes talk about the can't but can. In that situation with this mom who her husband had ALS and he can no longer play baseball, we talked about I can't play baseball with my son, but I can look at all of his baseball cards and we can order them online and collect them together. And I can have baseball night with him every Friday night. And so, doing what you can to stay in the day with your children and updating them on any changes that might happen in that day, any concrete physical changes that they observe, that can be very helpful while you're also trying to provide consistency and play dates and connecting and claiming your village of people to walk alongside of you, because we know anticipatory grief cannot be walked alone. And if people need other people in their corner to support them, to support their children, those three things of name it, reframe it, and claim it can be so helpful in helping families face the unknown in a way of let's dig our heels in and be on the lookout for how courage is going to grow through this.
Mm. The can't but can model is so good. I need to tuck that one away. And I think that would be really helpful for people to have that framework. I'm not going to be stuck in that can't. It's recognizing it and saying there's so much grief that I can't do that, and looking for the things that I can do.
Yes.
Allie and I were both certified child life specialists in the hospital, and I'm sure both of us have so many stories of how we've seen parents engage with their children in a truthful, loving, emotionally intelligent way that really set up their family well for success. Because as we witnessed parents sharing developmentally appropriate information with their children and keeping them in the loop and modeling what it looked like to express emotions and name emotions and also not sit there, those kids trusted their parents and could be sad. And then they could be happy. And then I'm sure we also had a lot of other stories that we could share where maybe the extremes where a parent was telling their kid, hey, we're going to go to Disney. Just joking, we're at the hospital to get surgery.
Yeah.
Things like that. It's a quite the extreme example, but stuff like that really builds distrust
Yeah.
in the parent-child relationship. And so I think you're doing a great job of explaining that it's okay to model being sad and being afraid and hopeful and showing up resiliently each day, because your children need to hear the truth from you. Doesn't mean you're going to trauma dump on them and tell them all the nitty-gritty details. There's a way to do it tactfully in a way that they can receive. If I could speak for both of us, that's where we've seen the most success in a healthy relationship as people interact with complex medical experience.
Exactly. I completely agree. It makes me think of the movie Inside Out, where there's this character named Bing Bong, and he gets very sad because he loses a wagon. Joy comes in and tries to cheer him up of like, it's okay. We'll get another wagon. Let's just jump straight into joy. But then along comes the character Sadness, and she sits with them. She sits with him and she validates him and says, oh, that's really sad. Oh, you must be missing your wagon. And again, that space to grieve what was, to grieve what is, to grieve what could be, But to know that grieving, again, is not without hope. And some people call it shifting hope, that hope is shaping the experience, not necessarily the outcome. So instead of asking, what's going to happen? It's instead, how can we find meaning together through this? How can we grow in this
Mhm.
together? That can be our hope. That can be our North Star. That every day we wake up and we look expectantly for how we are going to tackle this as a family and have honest conversations to build that trust, like you were saying, to help children see that they are capable. Parents and caregivers could be surprised on how much their kids can actually move life along in a lot of ways. They still want to eat their chicken nuggets. They still want to play. Even if you have
Mhm.
had a hard day, they still want to just go keep up the energy at times. And that can be a very beautiful thing to see the life of children and the way that they need that validation, they need that language, they need that permission, and they will also be there to help parents and caregivers through it too. And
Mhm.
I think about inheritance of hope and how you all are experts in meaning making, and things like legacy videos are not accepting, oh man, I need to make this because I may not be around. It's actually a very hope filled thing of like, again, if we're looking through the shifting hope of how do I make meaning in today, then recording a legacy video that could be watched on your birthday next year or at a graduation or something along those lines, doing whatever you can to be intentional in the days to really invite others in to hear your story, to be navigating that together as a family. That truly is so beautiful and life changing, even in that moment as we're waiting on the bus. Maybe something unexpected could happen through waiting and seeing
Mhm.
things that you've never noticed before about your family.
Yeah, not wasting the waiting where the anticipatory grief, okay, you name it, reframe it, claim it, and it doesn't mean that just because you're accepting anticipatory grief means that you're accepting a certain outcome. There's still that joy that can reframe things no matter what the outcome is. Whether it's the worst case scenario or best case scenario, that joy is not dependent on the circumstances, the outcome. Thank you so much for sharing all this insight. If people are wanting to learn more from you or access some of those resources you were talking about, how can they find you?
Yes, ma'am. So I would love to connect with anyone that is needing just that extra support of claiming a village. If I can ever be another person on someone's team, I would love to. You can visit my website. It's childlifetogo.co, not .com, .co. So it flows together, childlifetogo.co. And I also am on social media as well. If you search Child Life to Go, I also pop up there too.
I love that. And she has some amazing skits on Instagram that are very entertaining, educational, lots of good books and resources. So if you want to feel equipped in whatever situation you're in, she's got a lot of great stuff on her site. So we will put that in the show notes so that people can find you. This was such a lovely conversation. So thank you for sharing today.
Absolutely, Allie. I'm so grateful to connect with you and the Inheritance of Hope family abroad. It's such a pleasure. Thank you so much.